Hello, my name is Judith Baker Montano, and I'm here to teach you the basics of Victorian crazy quilting. Now, before we go to the sewing machine, I thought perhaps you'd like to know a little bit about the history and just exactly what is a crazy quilt. It all started during the Victorian era in the 1800s. This was named after Queen Victoria of England. Well, during the Centennial Exposition in 1876 in Philadelphia, the Japanese pavilion was the most popular of all, and one of the sources of fascination for the Victorian women was a screen, and this screen showed a Shinto priest walking down a paved road. Now, the paver stones is what fascinated the ladies because they were set out in an asymmetrical design, and they went home and tried to reproduce this in fabric, and that's how crazy quilting got started. Other historians believe that it's from the cracked ice on the Japanese china that the women tried to reproduce. Whatever way it was the first commercial craze for needlework in America. Everyone was getting in on this commercial craze, from manufacturers of silk to magazine people and even the cigarette makers. Now, the cigarette manufacturer would produce these rectangles of silk in the form of floral and fauna, actors and actresses, flags, and symbols of the cities or the provinces or states. Now, although women couldn't smoke in those days, they certainly collected these and used them in their crazy quilts. Now, the definition of a crazy quilt is really quite different than you would think. A crazy quilt is not a quilt. It was simply a way that the Victorian woman could show off her expertise in needlework. This was a small piece usually that was out in the parlor and for people to admire. It wasn't meant to be slept under. It is a matter of taking bits of asymmetrical pieces of cloth, sewing them down to a whole cloth piece, and then backing it like a pillowcase backing and tying it into place. Now, also, she would take wonderful little bits of mementos, such as the flags, such as a piece of evening gown or a baby christening gown, and new fabrics, and mix them all together to create her own memorabilia. Now, I use crazy quilting a little bit different. I like to use it as accessories for home decor, for clothing, and also to treat it like fine art pieces under glass. I have a few pieces here to show you, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. The first thing I have is this small pouch done in a pastel shade, and it's worked all in cottons. I have a lot of charms and beads on this piece. I think it's a charming piece, and it could be for a child as well as an adult. I'm also wearing my own personal pouch. This is an Indian fetish pouch that I enjoy making, and it has punch needle work on it and actual Indian fetishes and a little bit of turquoise. I've used ultra suede as the base. Here for home decor, I have a brush and mirror set. And you can see that these are, I'll turn them around here so you can see better, that they're done in soft, dusty tones, and they work well in my bedroom. Over here I have some clothing or accessories, and this is a wonderful belt. Now, I have a wonderful button collection that I'm quite proud of. The trouble is I could never show it off. So what I did was I made a belt, and I put the majority of my special buttons on the front loop. I've worked this piece up in jewel tone. Also, the vest I'm wearing, as you can see, we match quite well to the belt. I've used silk ribbon and silk fabrics, and I've even gone so far as to put some Indian nickel head buttons on this piece because I wear this as a Western outfit. Over here I have a piece that I've treated as a fine art piece. I framed this collage as a painting. Now, this was a Christmas gift for a friend, and I've used the Australian photo method to put the photographs of his parents onto silk, and then I've collaged them into this crazy quilt piece. Because the family was from Boston, I have lobsters. I've used the last name here. Over here, I've got initials worked into the piece, and a lot of old Victorian buttons. I've worked in a special color combination that is pleasing to him, and because my friend's a carpenter, I've even gone so far as to put a tape ruler in there. Now, before we go over to the work table, I want to draw your attention to my books. These books are going to be used throughout the program to refer to the Crazy Quilt Handbook or the Crazy Quilt Odyssey. Either one will do. The thing that I want you to refer to, of course, are the stitch guides and also the colored photographs. We'll be talking also about the use of color, and there's a wonderful color wheel in both of them. So let's go over to our work table and let's create our own masterpiece. Hi. Well, here I am at my sewing machine and just surrounded with unfinished projects, but then why should I be any different, eh? Now, before we go on to the actual sewing of our piece, what I want to do is talk to you about the use of a window template and a little bit about color. Everyone seems to have the impression that a crazy quilt is simply a hodgepodge of fabrics that have just been thrown down on a whole cloth piece. Well, that's not true. There's a lot of thought in it, and we have to stop thinking as a quilter, but more as a painter. You see, to me, crazy quilting is the most painterly of the quilting techniques. Now, I have here some window templates. Here I have a little heart. Here I have an oval. This is what I use to block out all kinds of visual interference from my design. Now, what I'm going to do is I have a little piece here that's been finished, and I'm going to just lay that up to this little heart template, and I'm going to twist and turn it, twist and turn. You see, by using the same fabrics and twisting it and then tracing out my design, I can come up with 5 or 6 different patterns. It's clever, isn't it? Now today, what we're going to do is we're going to be working with a little picture. We've talked about the template, and what we're going to use today is a matte frame. You see, just a little frame like this. That is going to become our window template. We're going to also use a piece of muslin, and that's going to become our canvas. You notice I've drawn the lines, the 5 by 7 inch lines onto the canvas. This piece will serve as our canvas to work on, and you'll notice that I've left ample room along the edges. This being, I want to be able to glue it into my mat, but I also want to leave a lot of room in case of error. Sometimes you'll set the tension wrong on your machine and it'll get wrinkled in the back and the piece will be too small. Better too big than not enough. I'm going to set these aside just for a minute and talk to you briefly about the use of color. I teach all over the world, and one of the biggest problems I run into is my students lack confidence in the use of color. Now, I have a very simple method for this. I think like a painter, and I'm going to teach you how to do the same. First of all, if you look in the Odyssey book or the handbook, you'll find that there's a simple color wheel in there, and I'm going to simplify the use of color way down for you. Now, every Christmas, we see red and green together. Now, I'm going to turn this to red, like so. I'm going to turn it to red. If you look straight across on your color wheel, you're going to find the color green. Any color that is opposite each other on the wheel are complementary colors, and they will always go together. If I turn it over here to orange, I'm going to find the opposite of that is blue. Those will always go together. They're complementary colors. Now let's turn it way over here to the other side and let's go to purple. One of my favorite colors, actually. I've turned it over here to violet or purple. Right across is orange. And there is a wonderful little pansy called a Jolly Joker that uses this color combination beautifully. One of the best uses of color is Mother Nature with her flowers, and you just have to look outside to see how it's used. Now, as a painter, we think in light, mediums, and darks. Let's say the painter wants to create a painting with lots of sunshine, sand, white buildings. So what he's going to do is take a big tube of titanium white and he's going to add that to his colors, and he's going to lighten the colors a lot. And in fabric terms, we're going to call those pastels. Now these are baby colors, very soft and feminine, and some of the fabrics that I use to highlight these colors is white and cream color. If the painter wants to create sort of a hazy desert scene, what he's going to do is add a little bit of black to his white paint, and he's going to gray it down ever so slightly. This is a lovely color combination, and you can see how it's been grayed down ever so little. Now, if you want to create this effect, this is good for a Victorian look. It looks antique-y, a little bit older. Now, colors that really highlight this look is taupe, that's that funny gray brown that goes warms with oranges and reds, and it goes cools with blue and green. Now also you can add light gray to this, and you can add cream color to it. If the painter wants to get quite dramatic and create sort of like a lovely old Rembrandt look or a very old antique look, what he's going to do is add even more black, and he's going to gray it down considerably. I often think of the lovely old Dutch tulip paintings when I think in this color sense. The painter is going to add all this black, and he's going to make it quite dramatic. What he's also going to do is he's going to use black with this, and in fabric terms we're going to call this a dark dusty. A dark dusty will look good with taupe, dark gray, black, and you can use highlights of silver and gold. And the gold is this old tin gold that you see in this piece here. It's almost a green cast to it. If the painter wants to create a real dramatic look, lots of contrast, such as Mardi Gras or fireworks going off in the night, he's going to use a lot of black, and he's going to use black actually even into his colors. Now, in fabric terms, we call those jewel tones. This is one of my favorite things to work in. And when I'm working with a jewel tone, I'll use black, and I'll use silver and gold, and a wonderful old rust orange that just sparkles when you use it with the jewel tones. Now, I realize we've gone over this quite fast, but one thing I want you to know is that the light tones and the darker tones do not mix. And you have to be very careful to keep it so that the eye travels smoothly over your crazy quilting. So think about what tone or shade you want to work with, and then pull your colors. Pull your fabrics. Now, when we're working with fabrics, this is the fun of it. You can use so many different types of fabrics, and it really makes the crazy quilt sparkle. You're going to choose the complementary colors, and you're going to choose the highlight colors ahead of time. You're going to also use a nice mix of pattern, texture, and solids. Now, there's only a few rules in my type of crazy quilting, and they're hard to break. And one cardinal rule is that you never put pattern against pattern. You want the embellishments or the embroidery work to really show up. And if you put pattern against pattern, it'll be so busy your needlework won't show up. So always keep in mind that you're going to bounce the complementary colors off of each other. You're going to bounce the pattern off of a solid piece. Now we're ready to start sewing, and I have chosen my fabrics ahead of time. Now I've chosen to work in a dark dusty, and I've chosen to work in plum colors and teal. So what I'm going to do is just show you some of the lovely fabrics that I've picked up. I have some Japanese obi fabric, some lovely antique silk, and some pretty fabric that's the jacquard weave that's using both of the colors, and it was a dime store fabric. Here we have some Thai silk, some more obi fabric, and down here I actually have some drapery weight moires that I've used for my solids. I have a nice selection of prints and solids and some texture. Texture is anything that has a bit of a feel to it, such as wool, slubby silk, moire fabric. And a solid, of course, is a solid, and you can use the right side or the back side of these fabrics. And also, don't think that you have to have this color bounce. You can work in monochromatic colors, or perhaps you wish to work in all solid colors for a more contemporary look. Can be country, it can be Victoriana, or it can be very contemporary. Now, I've got my fabrics laid out in front of me like so I can choose. And I have my little piece of muslin here, which really is acting as my canvas. And my fabrics are my paints. Now the first thing I have to do is think about where the centerpiece is going to be and what is it going to be. Now because of my rule that you can't bounce pattern against pattern, you're going to have to start with a solid center. Otherwise you'd have to go around with solids all the way around. And so I'm going to use black. The reason I'm using black is that, remember the rule of painting, lights come forward and darks recede. And I'll probably want this black piece to be a highlight. I may want to do some special embroidery. So the first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut 5 angles. Remember that number 5, an asymmetrical shape. Just cut a little bit more off here. I've got it looking a little bit like a house. Now, if you'll notice here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 angles. I'm going to lay it down onto my piece of muslin, and I am not going to bullseye it. Remember to keep everything a little bit off center. It's much more pleasing to the eye. I'm going to look at this and I'm going to decide where is my longest angle, because for some mathematical reason, which I don't understand, that first piece of fabric is always the smallest when you end up going around. And so don't use grandma's special fabric if you've only got a little bit of it. Now, also remember that if you are right-handed, you're going to continue to the right. If you're left-handed, you're going to go to the left. Whatever way you choose to go, it is very important that you cover all 5 sides before you cut any more shapes and sizes. Let me put my glasses on and I can see a little bit better. I want to tell you just before we begin, I want you to set your machine at a very long stitch. It's 3.5 here on my Bernina. And the reason being, that way I can pull a thread if I'm unhappy with the piece I have on. Another thing is you can put any color thread you wish as long as it won't show up through the fabric. This is a fold over and press method so that thread will never show. The first piece of fabric I've cut is this lovely piece of Italian metallic jacquard, and you notice that I've cut it in a very large fat rectangle. You're going to hear me say that a lot. It's very important that you cut a rectangle shape. Now I'm going to lay this right sides together down on the first angle, and I want that little bit of purple to show. I'm going to sew from the bottom of the angle to the top. Now I don't have to worry about 1/4 inch seams. I don't have to worry about straight of grain. I am literally making up a new piece of fabric. I'm going to trim this very carefully. Now, I'm going to press this piece back, like so. I've got my iron right over here, and I'll just reach over and do that. Now I use a steam iron in order to get a nice smooth finish. Now my next piece I'm going to sew on, of course, will have to be a solid because I've already used a pattern. So once again, I cut a fat rectangle, and now I'm going to lay it along the second angle. Now, you must remember this. I have a piece sewn down already. I'm going to do angle number 2. Now, so I have a previous piece of fabric, and I always tell my students to think of it as PPF, previous piece of fabric. I'm going to lay this along the second angle, and I'm going to cover the previous piece of fabric. Very important. It'll look just like that. Now, I'm going to sew along that angle. And I can literally feel with my fingers when I get to the edge of that second angle. Now, I'm going to trim out underneath very closely. And this is why it's important that you can peel back. There we go. Now I'm going to cut back very closely. Fold it back one more time, And once again, we're going to press. It's very important that you press well after you put each piece down. There we have angle 1 and angle 2. Now the next piece is this little angle right here. Right here, we're going to cover the previous piece. And once again, I can use a pattern. This time I'm going to use this beautiful piece of obi fabric. I think it's such a gorgeous design. Right sides together once more along the previous piece. I'm going to go right to the edge of the previous piece. And also notice that I always work in a wide rectangle shape. Whoops, I caught my thread there. Okay, I got it. Now I'm going to trim again. And this is very important that you always trim out every time you sew a piece down. First of all, you don't want any more bulk than necessary in your work, especially if you're going to wear it. And also, you don't want to have to embroider through all those layers. Press it back and look at this result. See how pretty it's turning out? I'm going to press it again. The next time around is angle number 4. And angle number 4 is going to have to be a solid. So let's use this. Oh, here's a pretty piece of tie silk. Let's use that. I like that. And once again, cut a nice wide rectangle and sew it down, covering the previous piece. Now that I have my 4 angles covered, I've got one left. And I'm going to show you, peel it back. There we go. Whoops, sorry. And we're just going to peel it back like that, trim it back. There we go. And press it one more time. Now we're at to angle 5. Here's angle 1, 2, 3, 4, and here's 5. Notice now we have 2 previous pieces. So we have to cover both these pieces, okay? Now this is going to be quite a long run across. And so I don't think I want a piece of fabric quite that big. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 pieces, I'm going to sew them together in irregular shapes, and I'm going to treat it as one strip. And I've just been eyeing this wonderful piece of Japanese fabric. I'm going to cut a piece like that. So I have a little piece like that, and I'm going to find myself one more piece, probably this one. This is a nice sort of a jacquard weave. Actually, it's a drapery weight moire that I found here in my local little town. I'm going to take these 2 pieces right side together, and I'm going to sew them together to create one strip. Crazy quilting is such a lovely free form. Okay, there we go, and I'm going to just press this out. And now I'm going to lay this right sides together, and I'm going to cover my previous piece, which is angles 1 and angle 4. There we go. And notice now I have to trim out from behind, very important. I tell you, you only have to run a needle through your finger one time and you soon learn to not have too much bulk to embroider through. Now let's press it out. Right here. And then we're going to talk about cutting shapes and sizes. When I turn it to the back, you'll notice I have pieces hanging out. Now this is imperative that we keep our design contained within that muslin pattern piece. So I'm just going to trim off very closely, like so. Right, all the way around, all the way around. Now I can turn it over and take a peek as to what I've got to work with. Here's angle 1, angle 2, angle 3, angle 4, and this piece here is angle 5. Now, it does look awfully strippy and angular, so now we have to cut shapes and sizes. Let me show you how we do that. This is the secret to my work, what makes it look interesting. I am literally going to cut from edge to edge on some of the pieces. I'm going to trim it down to size. I can turn this one over. Look at, there's a lovely triangle shape I can cut right there. And over here, I can come up and make a long, skinny triangle, about like that. There we go. I want to get these down, and I'm going to even peel this back again, just ever so little. There we go. And I'm going to peel this back. Remember when I told you that usually the first piece you put down is the smallest? Sure enough, there it is. Now this piece here, even though it's going right out to the edge, I think I'm going to leave it. I think you want a nice variety of small and large and shapes and sizes. So here I have sort of a rectangle shape, some triangle shapes to go around. Now I have to decide where to start. So I'm going to start right up here. This is going to be my new angle. So now I have 1, 2, 3, only 4 angles this time to fill in. So here we go. Now because this is treated as a solid, I can come in with a nice piece of pattern. And because it's also, I notice that it's a plum color, so I would like to have something that is a pattern and yet has more teal in it. Okay, now that I have my 5 sides on, I'm going to come back and add more fabrics, and this time I have a lovely little piece of pattern, and I'm going to start up here and work my way around. Remember that this is just the beginning of your Crazy Quilt collage. This is the first layer of color and texture that we're laying down. I'm going to continue on this, but let's take our break right now. I want to talk to you a little bit about my storybook recollections, and we'll come back with a finished piece and go on with lace and ribbons. Now I have my book right here, and this is called Recollections. And at the break time, I want to show you the collage that I actually worked up for the cover of this book. See you over in the living room. I thought you would enjoy seeing the actual piece worked up for the cover of Recollections. Now this piece is overkill on Victoriana, but did I ever enjoy it? I used lots of lace, lots of Victorian buttons, I used cigarette silks, and I worked in my favorite colors, those lovely dark, deep dusties. I don't know when enough is enough on a collage like this, but I certainly do enjoy it. And notice the silk ribbon embroidery on this piece. It really does highlight it. I'm going to just put this over to the side now and show you some other pieces that might give you some inspiration. I use a lot of Victorian pieces in my work. In fact, this piece here was a real inspiration for me. I found these old pansies worked up on a piece of black silk, and the silk was deteriorating out from the back, so I was able to use the actual pansies. I do a design line of cards and wrapping papers for Fox Hill. This was owned by my publisher, C&T. And anyway, every so often I have to come up with a new line. And this is a line called Victorian Pansies. I love pansies more than anything, and if you read Recollections, there's a whole chapter about a lovely old gentleman and pansies called Jolly Jokers. Now I took my inspiration really from the necklace I'm wearing right now. You know, this necklace has brought me a lot of pleasure. I love that color combination of purple and rust orange, and you remember we talked about earlier that those are complementary colors. I also love the buttons, little pansy face buttons, and I love anything that jingles and jangles. It's really a lot of fun. Now from all this traditional crazy quilting, I can also work up Crazy Quilt landscapes. And you've heard me talking about these. Now if you look over my shoulder, you'll see that I actually have a landscape piece there. Now this piece has been worked up for my book Elegant Stitches. It's my own personal piece. It hangs over my fireplace. It's called Just Over That Hill Was My Home. Here in the right-hand corner, I've used traditional crazy quilting to give the impression of a wheat field. Now I've taken fabric that I like, and the colors are just right for me. And I've scrunched them, I've wrinkled them up, and I have burned them. I've also taken yarn and threads and ribbons to give the impression of wheat, the grass, and the weeds that grow in that area. If you'll notice, there's also beads and buttons and crystals. You can use anything for embellishments, but we'll go into that in my new video on embellishing, which will be coming out quite soon. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm ready to get back to our work table. I want to teach you embroidery and how to highlight your Crazy Quilt collage. So let's go. That was a good break, wasn't it? Well, here you can see I have the finished piece, and I added other pieces before the break. And the angles that I added were over here, and up here, and a double-sided piece in here. Now, it looks quite angular, and I've got to get away from that, and the way we can do that is by adding our lace and ribbon and embellishments. But before, we have to mark the outer perimeter. I'm going to lay my window or my mat down, and I'm going to twist and turn to see how I like it. And I have chosen to use this design. Excuse me. I'm going to just mark along the edge, like so. There we go. Now I have 1/4 of an inch that I must leave, excuse me, and the reason being is I have to have something to glue into the mat. So I'm just going to trim along these edges and tidy it up a bit. It always makes me feel good to have these nice crisp edges on my work. And you know, really, you don't want to have to embroider or embellish any more than necessary, and especially on a picture, because it'll be too bulky to glue into the mat. There we go. And I'm going to give it one more press just to be safe, and then we're ready for the fun part, the lace and ribbons. Now the fun begins. We're going to do lace and ribbon. Now I have a few pieces here just to show you, to give you an idea of what you can use. I have a handkerchief here. I have a lovely piece of new lace that has been coffee dyed. I have some Victorian beaded trim and a knit doily, a little Victorian piece again. Here's some wonderful 18th century metallic lace, a doily that I bought in the local dime store, and some silk lace. Any of these things could be laid down. Now you notice I talked to you earlier about this being coffee dyed. Let me tell you how to do that. I brought with me a doily that's white, and as you can see, when you lay that down on my dark dusty, it is just too white and too bright. I have a cup of coffee here, and I'm just going to dunk it in. And I'm going to leave that for a few minutes, and we'll get back to it later. And you'll find a big surprise. It's got a lovely antique look to it. The one thing I'm going to use is a glue stick. Now, please don't tell everybody that I glue stick everything down, because I don't. I use it just temporarily to hold things in places so that I can see what my collage is going to look like. And then I'll come in later with embroidery and I'll actually sew it down. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take a little bit of a doily here, and I'm going to lay it down about like that. I'm going to just touch the back with my glue stick, and I use a very light hand. Please don't get too much of the glue on the doily. You just want to lay it down there for temporary. I'm going to cut this off like so. Now, if I'm going to lay lace or ribbons in, I'm going to be very careful to go to edge so I have the raw edges from side to side, and I'm also going to make sure I don't lay it along a seam line. The reason being, I want to save the seam lines for my embroidery work. I'm just going to take this beautiful antique beaded trim, and we're going to start up in one corner and literally meander around so that we get some nice flowy lines to get away from those angular lines that we've created. Now let's add one more piece, and I think that's sufficient. You know, lace and ribbons is a very personal thing. Either you like it or you don't. And I love to use it in my picture pieces, but I'm dying to use this piece of antique metallic lace. And I'm going to lay it right up here in the top. This is especially pretty. And I don't mind that it has those rough edges. I think it really adds to the piece. There we go. I'll turn this over, hold it up for you, and you can get sort of an idea of what we've created. Okay, now we're ready to embroider. We're ready to learn some new stitches, and the first one I'm going to teach you is called the feather stitch, or turkey tracks, or hen scratch. It is the most typical of the Victorian crazy quilt, and I must say the most difficult. But let's use this hoop here with the dark background and a bright thread, and perhaps it'll make it easier for you to see. I've drawn a white line here that will represent a seam line. Now in crazy quilting, every seam line is covered with embroidery stitches. Now the feather stitch is a vertical, straight up and down stitch. It's important to get your fingers underneath the fabric and your thumb on top. It's going to be your anchor. Come up at the top, lay that line of embroidery thread right on the seam line. Come straight across from where you just came out, and you're going to make a V into the seam line. Now, if you're right-handed, this next part will be difficult. Make a visual loop, actual loop, and go straight across on the other side and make a V into the seam line. Don't pull it tight or you'll get V's instead of U's. Now let's loop to the right again, my right, and go straight across and make a V into the seam line. Remember that the needle is always going to come over the thread. Let's loop to the left, over your thumb, straight across, make a V into the seam line. You consider how difficult this will feel. After a few minutes of practice, actually, you'll get better and better. You see how it alternates back and forth? I tell my students that by laying the actual threads in this loop, the eye tells the brain, that tells the hand it can do it. There you go. And I just alternate back and forth. And that's what the design looks like. The next stitch is going to be a combination of stitches. The herringbone, which is the old hemming stitch, combined with the straight stitch and a lazy daisy. That's a secret to some of my work. I like to combine stitches in a pleasing fashion. I'm going to start with a horizontal line this time. I'm going to start below my line, and I'm going to come up and take a little, keep my thread down, and take a little back stitch. And I'm traveling from my left to my right. And I keep down at the bottom, a little back stitch, leave my thread down, come to the top, take another little back stitch, leave my thread up. Come to the bottom, take a little back stitch, leave my thread down. The secret to this, of course, like any stitch, is keeping it even. But don't worry, you know, design is repetition of line. If you don't get it just right the first time, just keep going. And at the next seam line, you'll try to do it a little bit better. I'm just going to travel across like this, and I'm not going to take many more stitches. There, maybe one more. And then we're going to add the straight stitch. Now I'm going to come up with a straight stitch, and I'm going to use this lovely bright fuchsia, and I'm just going to catch it where the X's cross, like putting a little tie or a bow tie on a man's shirt. We're just going to go right across with a running stitch. And you see, we just want a dot of color. We don't want a big bar of color, but one of the secrets to my work is that I combine different colors together And even that makes the stitch look more difficult than it really is. And I'll just turn around and go back down the other side with that dot of color. Okay, we've had the herringbone stitch and a straight stitch. Now let's use a gold thread and come up in the V's and add a lazy daisy. You form a loop like that and put a tail on it. Now you can make that tail short or long and make different designs that way. Make an actual loop, go back in the same hole, come away in a teardrop shape. Make sure your needle passes over that thread and put a tail on it. We continue down on both sides, and this makes a lovely wide decorative stitch. It's a very good stitch to use like in a dart area of a Crazy Quilt vest, or maybe you want to highlight certain colors. There we go. You can see, and I'll continue on both sides. I'm going to show you two stitches on the same line. One is called the chevron and the other one is called the cretin. Now they're both related in stitch-wise to the herringbone, and I'm going to just start down here and show you why. Again, I'm going to start below my seam line. And remember how with the herringbone we took a little back stitch? This time we're going to take two little back stitches. We're going to take one back stitch, we're going to leave our thread down, we're going to take another little back stitch, and there we have a little top. Now I'm going to take a little back stitch on the bottom. Remember, I'm traveling left to right again, another little one. It takes a lot of practice to get these tabletops sitting straight. I never have conquered that yet. There we go, second stitch, and one on the bottom. Little back stitch, and a second back stitch into the center portion. Remember to refer to the Crazy Quilt Odyssey or the handbook when you want to really study these stitches up close. There we go. Now this one is called the chevron. And you can see how it's related with those two little back stitches. Now let's just pause right here, and we're going to switch the angle of the needle, and we're going to do a cretin stitch. Once again, I would start on the bottom below the line, working left to right, and this time I'm going to literally swing my needle straight up and down towards the seam line, but not into it. Now you can see this better this way. I'm going to go towards the seam line, but not into it. And I have to bring my needle across my thread, see that, to form the pattern. Once again, towards the seam line, but not into it. It's a little straight up and down back stitch. And that's a very traditional Victorian stitch. It's called the cretin. This was the hardest one for me to conquer. And now that I've used it in that sequence, I can remember it quite well. Well, let me show you I'll show off a little bit for you here. Watch what happens when I combine it with a herringbone on the bottom, perhaps the chevron on top, and maybe I swing my needle and I make a cretin stitch on the bottom. And I can make up designs using this method. Okay? It's really fun to think up combinations and different designs using those traditional stitches. I like to use the hint of a spider web rather than try to do the whole wagon wheel effect. One of the reasons is when I looked in my old book, the handbook, I realized that I had a spider web in there that looked like a wagon wheel in space. It wasn't connecting to anything. So now I like to do a corner web. I've drawn this L shape here with the white pencil just to give the indication of a corner. Now I'm just going to put my spokes in with this lovely iridescent metallic thread, and I'm just going to pretend that we're anchoring into other lines of crazy quilting. I keep coming back up to the top, And remember what I was telling you about asymmetrical design. We want it to be uneven. Okay, let's say we've got 3 spokes. Now what I'm going to do is simply come back and couch over each one of those threads. Just loop over and catch them down. First of all, we don't want to leave loose threads like that to get caught up. Somebody might pick at it or it'll come loose. And you just couch up and down. And you can see by doing all 3 of them, if I go up this side, down, and up again, I'd be right back up here to the top. So let's just pretend we finished that. Now what I need to do is come and put my connector spokes in. And I am just literally going to come down and catch a thread underneath. It's hard from, there we go. I'm just coming across like that. Just catching a thread here and there. And I'll go across until I connect to the other side. I'll move down just ever so slightly and do the same thing going back across until I have enough of the web. I don't go right to the very edge with the web. As I said, I think the hint of a web is just as pretty as the actual whole web. I have a finished one here on a piece of Crazy Quilting that I'll show you. There we go. Okay. Now, I'm going to just lift this piece up. And this is a piece that I've done for a design line for cards, and right here next to this pretty woman is a spider web on this dark green. And you can see I have 3 major spokes, and then I have 1, 2, 3 lines of the connector spokes, and I've couched down all these threads. By using an iridescent threads, it makes it look much more realistic and pretty. Now that we have all the embroidery stitches done, and we have a little bit of silk ribbon put onto this piece, now the time is for beading and for adding buttons and doodads. I just laid my mat down, the first mat down here, to see what it would look like. I'm quite pleased with it. Hold it up there so you can see. You see how that lovely wire ribbon adds a dimension down in the foreground? And the silk ribbon embroidery really does add a little bit more interest there in our centerpiece. Now what I'm going to do is show you how to put on the beads and buttons and the doodads, and I'm going to use a special method for that. Just put this down here, and I want you to look at this. This is a small spool of Nemo or Nymo thread. And what we're also going to use is a number 10 Sharps beading needle. Because I'm only putting on 1 bead at a time, it's quite important that you have a shorter needle instead of the long beater. Okay. Now, and I've had to search around to find something that could contain all my beads and buttons. Usually I use a white plate, like a plastic plate. I want something that I can get my hands into and that I can actually see my beads. And I really want my beads to lay up on their side. You see, the beauty of a bead is on the side, not on the whole side. The first thing I'm going to do is just treat those beads as if they were French knots, and I'm going to put a bead at the end of all my different stitches. Just pick it up here. Whoa, I can't see. There we go. You know, inevitably, if you pick up a bead that doesn't fit on your needle, you'll pick that bead up a dozen different times. So just throw it away immediately. Don't put it back into the bowl. I'm going to add a collection of colors here on these stitches. And eventually what I'll do is I'll bead every line of stitching in my work. Now every 4 or 5 stitches, depending on if it's going to be worn a lot or if it's going to get a lot of wear and tear, such as a pendant. Oops, there's a bead that doesn't fit. Down it goes. I'm going to go to the back and do a slip knot. I'll just turn it over like so and do a little slip knot here on the back, catching it like so. Now we'll come back after I get this all beaded and I'll show you how to put on some buttons and the charms. I've been working along on this piece, adding some Victorian buttons and a Canadian maple leaf and a little bird charm, and I've got all my seams now beaded as much as I've wanted to do. I'm going to add one last little button just to give you an idea of how I work with the Nemo and the beads. You see, instead of using threads, I'm going to use the Nemo to attach my buttons, and I'm beading at the same time. I just want to show you how I do that. Now what I'm going to do is just work over here in this area, and I'm going to pick up a little button that has 2 holes in it. I'm just going to attach this down like so, and I'm going to anchor it with the Nemo. It's almost invisible, this lovely thread. It's what my Indian friends use for their beadwork, and it won't deteriorate with perspiration or with laundry, and so I think it's very good. Now I'm going to pick up a couple of beads, just interesting colors here, and I'm going to go back down again into the holes like so, and see, it just makes it a little bit more interesting. I've added 2 beads there. Now what happens if I add 3? It'll just create a little more interest. I can keep adding more and more beads to these until it actually almost covers the button. There we go. See how pretty that is? I have my first mat here, and what I did was I put a line of tacky glue along the edge, and then I taped it into place to hold it down firmly. When I turn it over, I'll show you the finished piece. I think we did very well considering the short time we've had to work in. And you can see the Victorian buttons and the charms and the silk ribbon and the silk buttonhole twist and the wire ribbon has all added up to be a beautiful collage. Now the next thing I want to do is turn it back over, and I'm going to take a piece of pellon or fleece, and I've cut 2 layers of this, and I'm going to lay it right along the opening of that first mat. Okay, now if I was going to finish this up totally, I would put all kinds of tacky glue along these edges here, and then I would lay my mat on top like so, wedging them both together. And I take books and whatever I can use to firmly push this into place. Do you see what's happening there? You can see that if I had it glued down firmly, it would bulge up, making a nice firm. I think if I hold it like that, you can see that it's bulging out. Now let's just pretend that that's glued down, and then I'm going to come along and add my second mat. Now I can lay this mat and glue it right down, or I can take strips of foam core and I can lift it ever so slightly to give it a shadow box effect. And I do that often because I put my work behind non-glare glass and I don't want any of it touching. One of the perfect examples we can use is the finished piece I was showing you earlier. Now here's the piece that I talked to you about in my introduction. It's the frame piece that I gave to my friend for Christmas. Now if you'll notice, I've taken a lot of padding and put it in the back of this piece, and I have 2 mats that I've wedged foam core in between to act as a buffer. You see, you don't want the glass to touch any of the needlework or the doodads or the charm or the fabric. And then I've used non-glare glass and I've framed it with a burl walnut finished frame. I think it makes a beautiful picture, and which brings me to a point. If you are going to view your work as art and treat it as art, others will too. Now let's just take one last look at our finished project. There we go, right here. This little piece here although it's only 5 inches by 7 inches, is also considered a piece of art. You can take your nostalgic pieces of fabric, brand new fabrics, mementos that you have around the house, and make your own work of art. In this lesson, we've covered putting down the base work of crazy quilting. We've talked about color, textures, and fabrics, and we've also talked about embroidery stitches, laces, and ribbons. We've also covered a little bit of embellishments, as for example, beadwork, laying down charms, and adding buttons. So really, from a framed piece of crazy quilting, and over here, a frame made of crazy quilting, you can see how versatile this art form is. I want to say goodbye now and tell you that perhaps if I'm teaching or lecturing in your country or your area and our paths happen to cross, please come up and say hello to me. I'd like that very much. Goodbye for now.